Good evening, this time not from Kiev but Riga. This is Hromadske International and the Sunday Show, the only prime-time TV discussion explaining Eastern European geopolitical storm in English, and I'm Nataliya Gumenyuk. So, Hromadske International is for years already the partner of Riga Security Conference, so we have our discussion about the most acute, the most important stories of this week from the Riga National Library, where the conference takes place. And of course we discuss NATO, of course we discuss a lot of security issues, but the story which had been broken this week was the story about the identity of one of the suspected assassinates in the case of Skripal in the UK, who turned to be a Russian Russian military officer. And obviously this is a new development, and as we found out, there is a lot to say about the whole case, and it will have influence obviously on the security in the region. And I'm happy that in the discussion at this show we'll have Mikhail Fishman, who is a prominent Russian journalist and analyst and the anchor at TV Rain, and based in Moscow. And as well we would have Kadri Liik, who is the senior expert for the European Council for Foreign Affairs. She is expert on Russia, based in London, so are the best people to discuss the issue, as well with the quote of the James Sher, a renowned analyst and the fellow at Chatham House. So that's what we have for you tonight. Misha, you're based in Moscow, Kadri, you're based in London. I had a chance to be in London this week, and at the day when the papers were coming out with news that Bashirov, the person named by himself like that, and the one who is suspected an killer in case of Skripal, that he is working for for Russian military agency. And it was all over the, it was everywhere, but really how the story is now discussed in Moscow and in London. We also found out that, according to Bellingcat and the Insider, that he was fighting in the war in the eastern Ukraine.
And his real name is Chipiga. So, and he is hero of Russia, according to all the papers that they got, and it looks very, very impressive, of course. And if he is a hero of Russia, that means that he was awarded with this award, and it's a presidential award. And it means that in the Kremlin they know him, because it's their job to award this hero of Russia status. So for them, it's kind of a tricky situation now, because they have to somehow to respond. And Dmitry Peskov, Putin's press secretary, he found himself in a very difficult position, answering numbers of questions of, well, did you look in your archives in the Kremlin who this guy is and where he is now?
Yeah, and he has this kind of thing that, oh, a lot of people look alike. You can find 15 Lenins and Stalins. People look like Lenin and Stalin.
Which is a very weird argument, actually, because yes, there are various Lenins on the Red Square in Moscow, but there are some real people disguised as Lenin. So the question here is, who is disguised as who? Chipiga as Bashirov or Bashirov as Chipiga? Who knows that? So that's a weird argument, I would say.
So Kadri, what is the discussion in London? What can follow this situation, and what this real name means?
I think that London feels quite vindicated, because the version of what happened in Salisbury has been beautifully backed up by British own investigation as well as Bellingcat's. First there was British investigation, and they showed us how two people have turned up in London and Salisbury and flown from Moscow and flown back to Moscow. That was very convincing, and that was exactly what I had expected the British police to provide us, following what happened in spring. And then Bellingcat took over and exposed the real identity, supposedly real identity of one of the suspects, and that made it even better. So I think London is quite happy where we stand in terms of investigation. As concerns the next steps, what should follow, it's less clear. Some people in London say that there should be additional sanctions towards Russia because of that. But that is, I think, hard to do because European sanctions against Russia are all linked to Ukraine and Minsk agreement. I think they are solid, but it would be very hard to find unanimity to upgrade them or to downgrade. So I don't think that adding additional sanctions is doable. Plus, there is a feeling that expulsions of diplomats that followed the Salisbury incident in spring, that was already something quite big, and it was a big thing. I mean, by standards of expulsions, that was huge. So I don't think there is unanimity in Europe or in the West to do something much in addition. But the question, of course, how to deal with Russia, who does such things in other people's countries and doesn't want to bear responsibility, how to behave with it. That question is there, and that is even not only London's question. I mean, the Dutch are having their own investigation into MH17, and that is going into court. And so things are happening in multiple places.
And Misha, how it feels in Moscow? I remember we've talked with you. It was just before the elections of President Putin, and it was when the story was ongoing. And there was a feeling that there was something scary, that maybe there would be some action, strong, tough actions from the West. Now there are more evidence, but really, are people confused? Are people expecting something new? And, you know, I know people are laughing, of course. A lot of people are laughing at that, but in the end, it's not really funny.
Well, it's not funny, but yet it is.
It's awkward, yeah.
Yet it is, because really the way the Kremlin dealt with the whole story is nothing we have seen before. Just nothing. It's actually very different. I remember when the whole Litvinenko incident happened. Lugovoy, who was the main suspect in this murder, he is well, real human being with his own past, with his own present, and the message that, well, of course, they were not cooperating with the British, but they were sending the message back then in 2007 that he didn't do it. That was the message. We didn't do it. Oh, it could be convincing or not so convincing, but the message was that the Kremlin or this Lugovoy guy or us, whoever, we do not have anything to do with it. We didn't murder Litvinenko. That was the message. Now it's totally different. Now the message behind this interview and, well, all that followed, now the Kremlin has to deal with this new identity of the main suspect in the whole story, and the way they deal with it is that they deliver a totally other message. Those who were not convinced that Russia stands behind it are now convinced. That's the outcome. That's what they achieved, and the message is, yes, we did it, but still you can't 100% prove it, and there is nothing you can do. Mm-hmm. That's the message, the main message from the very start, when actually, and Putin started it because he took the responsibility. He personally invited Bashirov and Petrov to take floor. And
why do you think he's personally invited? Why we would use that kind of frame that it was Putin who invited them?
He's probably sees it as his own challenge, as his own job, as his own job. Yes, that he has to do it because it's about him somehow.
He said so in an interview that these people could come out. To me, there are still things I don't understand about that story. I mean, first, why was it necessary? Because, I mean, unlike many others, Skripal was exchange spy, and they have been safe, immune so far. So why go after him? I still find it quite extraordinary, and I don't know the reason. And why send such a high-level person as that Chepiga guy seems to be, a colonel, decorated hero of Russia? That's a big deal. So why? And yes, why handle it the way they are handling it? If the point is to send a message, then that makes sense, because message sort of adds up. We did it. But the question of why is still not answered to me.
And this connection, of course, for Ukrainians, it's obviously important to mention that these are the same people. It's not some kind of a separate war against the West, but you see the guy who've been fighting in the Donbass, and you see him doing something else in overseas. What can it influence, at least in the discussion, this kind of the connection that, this UK-Russia, I would say, conflict, whatever, is somehow also is done by the very same people?
I think actually...
I know that Ukraine is not any longer popular in Russian media discussion. I know.
Well, actually, I think that if these people work for GRU, they go where they are sent to. And GRU works in different regions. So in that sense, you're like a soldier. You go where you are sent. So in that sense, I wouldn't really see a special meaning there, although all that you said seems to be true.
And it's yet still not an established fact. It's very likely, yes, that they somehow took part in some military operations in or close to Donbass somehow. But it's what Bellingcat and insiders sort of figured out. There is no source who actually proved it true yet.
We definitely still see some denial, but Misha, like in general, if I'm speaking about the, let's say, more official side, are they more in denial but confident mode, in denial but no in panic mode? What are now the feeling with this conflict with the West, with the UK, that, concerned that there would be more sanctions, or it just taking for granted that that's a new reality?
You mean the Kremlin?
Yeah, I mean the Kremlin, or at least the people we can speak there, and really to get the feeling not just from at least a bit of insiders.
Dmitry Peskov, who is the only person really taking the whole thing on himself during last days, he remains calm as a fish, basically, and he just denies everything the way he can. I think that I had an impression that they were quite nervous about it back then in March. Now, though it could be a mistake, and they probably were ready. But I had this impression back then. Now it looks like they basically just don't care. That's the impression that we get in Moscow, that they do not really care how plausible the whole thing that they show as their argument looks like. They just don't care.
So maybe
whatever you think about it, it's your own choice.
It's the way they have handled it is amazing in some ways. I followed very closely what Russian MFA did in the spring, and they gave that briefing on chemical weapons, which was a complete disaster. So this arrogant language, the way they compared Salisbury to MH17. I mean, what does that communicate to the West? You compare it to MH17. Come on, guys. But I assume that MFA also didn't have proper instructions at the time. They didn't know what really happened, who went there and why. So they just tried to sort of fight it off as best as they could without really having any knowledge as to what they are dealing with.
Before the whole follow-up happened, the two latest ones, they apparently could have dealt with, yes, this Special Commission on Chemical Weapons if they would want to avoid this second wave of sanctions coming from the Americans in November, or somehow at least try to play it softer. They had these resources. They could have avoided the major storm, yet they did nothing.
But also, I think the second wave of American sanctions was also largely also inspired by Trump's meeting with Putin in Helsinki and the way they addressed election meddling. I mean, sort of Trump accusing his own special services and siding with Putin, that infuriated the Congress. So I think sanctions were sealed at that moment.
How does London feels and the leadership of the UK in this situation, and also to what extent this is a discussion as well there that, you know, you can't protect us on our own soil? How serious is that? Because maybe in case of in Russia, let's be honest, somebody can afford not to care of what public thinks, but does it matter for the British public?
It does matter.
And also for inner politics in the UK.
It does matter, but I think the public feels safe. I mean, it's unfortunate that one person has died, but I think that on sort of fieldwork level, the British police have informed the public pretty diligently, and I actually admire the job they are doing. My respect towards British politicians is somewhat shaky, but towards rank and file policemen, I have profound respect, and I think they do their job professionally, and that includes the due warning, sealing of areas if needed, giving information. I think they have handled it well. So in that sense, the whole situation is under control. The general public, they understand what happened. It's rational. It's not something is happening you do not understand. There is talk, however, that maybe the UK has allowed in too many foreigners with unclear aims, and that's mostly about Russian money in the city of London. The property they have bought, the companies. So people are looking into that. What is it doing there? But question as to whether it leads to a proper cleanup that London badly needs, I would say. I rent a flat in London. I know what the real estate prices are like, and they are like that also due to foreigners, Russians, wealthy Arabs, who just deposit their money in London. So, but many people benefit from it as well. So it still remains to be seen as to what extent they will really clean up the business environment.
And Misha, how do the oligarchs today, a lot of these billionaires which have a lot of real estate, maybe less in the US, but there are more and more sanctions coming. There was the cases that Switzerland won't give a citizenship to Abramovich. To Abramovich, yeah. So not to be kind of, because it would be bad for their public image. Do you know today? Do the Russian oligarchs, which are close to the powers, feel really that it's not the business as usual, so they're not that easy going to London or other capitals, that it's better to stay home or maybe, move, I don't know, somewhere else?
I don't know, but I assume that they feel pretty much unsafe. Those who make the top 10, 20, 30 of the Forbes list, for sure, they actually are between two sort of evils, let's say, now, because their assets and their business activity in the West is now risky, and they have to evaluate these risks. And, well, everyone saw what happened with Deripaska already recently. That was very impressive. And, but what is the answer to these risks? Come back home? Also not so. I imagine no one really wants that. So that's a real problem. And in this fight, everyone is on his own, I would say. So that's how they will deal with it. I think that it's still slightly exaggerated, that they are under real sort of fire and pressure and they will have to leave, all of them. I don't think this is the case. But still, the risks are growing and they have to deal with them.
Kadri, do you see that there is any really more movement on doing something with particularly this politically exposed persons from Russia and the region?
I don't know how far it goes. It's clearly a bigger topic. People talk, people show their houses in London. There is even a thing called kleptocracy tour. You can take a tour in London and visit all the houses that have been bought for stolen money, including, I believe, Ukrainians. Yeah, I'd like to do that one day. That should be very interesting. But as to what extent it will amount to sort of tough action, that remains to be seen. And also, I don't think it's actually a British question. I don't think it is European, because these things are under domestic legislation largely. So it's up to the local politicians, and British politicians are not in the best of shapes, to put it mildly. Bogged down with Brexit, that is going nowhere, at loggerheads. So to what extent there is political capacity to really act, we'll see.
I also would like to say that we have also the comment of James Sher, who is a senior fellow at Chatham House, on the case of Skripal.
This is not the first time a Russian citizen has been attacked in mysterious circumstances in the UK. The Russian embassy in London published last year a list of 51 Russian citizens residing in Britain whose return, extradition, Russia had sought, and this was denied. The Russian conclusion to this is very obvious, that the UK's state policy is to provide a refuge for opponents and traitors. A number of these people since have died under mysterious circumstances, and there was no sign of any British response or even any serious investigation. So naturally, this starts to make them feel that it's a permissive environment to act again. On top of that, in 2010, we had a major defense review, which greatly diminished our military capability, and whatever the merits of it, the Russian conclusion and the General Staff conclusion, and hence the GRU conclusion, was Britain is taking itself out of the great power game. So there was every expectation that this could be done successfully without any serious response. And there is another minor, very interesting element. Skripal was released through an interstate agreement with Russia, because the UK takes agreements seriously. We did not perceive he was in danger, so he had no security protection, which made it easier for them to do this. Unlike some people, who are high priority targets for them, who are well protected and well secluded. So that, as ever, there's an assortment of reasons why they went after him.
The whole, let's say, performance around that case, the appearance of those two suspects on the RT, but later also the fact that we found out that Bashirov is Chapiga and he is the GRU officer. What does it mean? How we should read it? And also his participation in the war in Donbass.
I think one has to conclude, not for the first time, the Russians on the one hand are the Russian services and the state. Very professional, very resourceful, very determined, but can also at the same time be spectacularly clumsy and incompetent. And I would put it in the following way. I think we have seen many demonstrations that, particularly under Putin, the Kremlin is very good at unbalancing and surprising its opponents. But when they are surprised, they do not react in a common professional manner because they're not used to it. If you return to what I said a moment ago about the image of weakness we projected, I think they were very surprised by our reaction. They were surprised by a lot of demonstrations of just how professional our police work was, how professional our counterintelligence work was, how the fact that we saved the lives of these people, that it was very easy in our system for the experts in the Porton Down Chemical Research Laboratory to work with the doctors in the hospital, for the police to be included, for the local authorities to be included. Russia doesn't work like this. Russia is all vertical. The UK's competence is horizontal. People from different institutions talking to one another, exchanging information quickly and on the basis of trust. This is something Russians don't understand. I think it unbalanced them, and so they simply started overloading all their channels of disinformation. They just put more disinformation in them, and they started overloading them and made themselves appear completely ridiculous. And the climax of this was this interview with Simonyan.
One person who is based in London and is also extremely rich, but today is a dissident, is Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who has been here in Riga yesterday night. Kadri, you were moderating the session with his participation. So really, what is your impression and how also you describe all this? We're here for a couple of years. We already come into this conference. And of course, in the Baltic states, there are more like connection. You have speakers from Russia, but rarely representing the government.
Last year, there was someone representing the government.
Yeah, now less and less.
Now less and less.
And for instance, the web expert mentioned that this year, when there was a big conference in Ukraine, YES conference, there was no Russians at all. Though 5-7 years, it was really a lot, you know. So it's really like you can measure that. But what was your feeling? It was your impression? Because for a lot of people, it's like all the same discussion. What you do, it's a bit criminology, how you use it. That is more or less the same story. How powerful is Putin? But what do you think? What we learned?
You always learn something. But it can be quite little because, you know, people who, like me, spend their days watching Russia. I mean, it cannot be that you learn a lot. That would mean that you have done your job badly. But I think Khodorkovsky, of course, was interesting to our audience, and his vision for the future of Russia, how it seemed like he wanted to provoke the Russian regime into a sharpest standoff with the society, and the political regime he imagines sort of non-party parliamentarism, but something based on regionalism. I find it unrealistic, not even desirable. I don't think that sort of strong clashes between the power and society are necessary. I think Putin regime needs to leave the stage in a different way. But I think for many people it was interesting and relevant to listen because Khodorkovsky is still a person in Russian politics, even if he's not in Russia, but trying to influence things from abroad. So in that sense, I think people learned something. And also today's discussion, I liked that one even better in a way, about Russian history and what makes Russia Russia.
I unfortunately was not present yesterday. I had my show, so I only showed up this morning, so I missed it. But it should have been very interesting.
You can say, tell us to what extent Khodorkovsky is influencing anything in Russia and how he's seen from Moscow. Is he really a player or just somebody who is now far away doing some media activities?
Yeah, well, let's not exaggerate, of course, his influence on real sort of political movements. and developments. Well, of course, he has some kind of stake in Russian so-called non-system opposition. But, well, what is it? The whole non-system opposition and opposition in Russia. It's pretty much a ruin, of course, at the moment. So let's not exaggerate his influence. Though he has some, well, at least. The problem is that there is a specific, I think, very unfair, in fact, evaluation of Khodorkovsky in Russia, based on his oligarch past. Yet people, even from sort of liberal camp, do not sort of trust him. I know many people like that, who, and among liberal independent journalistic circles as well, it comes back to early 2000s, when he had this image of being very harsh and strong oligarch who does not really want to be liked so much. To that kind of image, it still sort of stands. I think it's very unfair in the evaluation of Khodorkovsky, even getting back to these two early 2000s, but that's apparently reality. So for him to, it of course makes things more difficult for him to trying to bring people together, to trying to build coalitions or somehow at least exchange. He has this problematic image, and it doesn't help him, unfortunately.
And, my final is this: the story we would like to remind and keep awareness of the public is the story of Oleg Sentsov. You know, because it's not that much popular any longer, in particular in Western media, because, you know, it's too long. He's almost 140 days on hunger strike. He's in critical mode. And it looked like nothing had worked, neither talks with Merkel, Macron talking to Putin. To what extent, I remember when the hunger strike was announced, there was some movement among the liberal Russians. They were talking, there was some activity, there was calls. How it's now, and what do you feel? Because that's why Ukrainian society feels very powerless. There is zero way Ukrainian society influences Russian politicians or Vladimir Putin. So there is a bit of the hope that maybe this story would be a bit bigger, a bit louder in Russia, or it's kind of declining. And what do you think? Who are the players to influence?
It became quite big. And yes, Macron was personally involved. They discussed it a few times at least. Putin even exchanged some views on how to solve this problem, apparently according to recordings of their last phone conversations. And yet nothing happened. Well, Russian society is as powerless as Ukrainian is, as you clearly understand. So not much can be done. I think that it could be that this poise that Russia has taken on the global scene, we don't care. Probably Sentsov's issue could be also influenced, sort of, by this poise, by this position, that Vladimir Putin maybe doesn't really care about what will happen with Sentsov. And this is the worst scenario that we can have.
Kadri, I'll ask that because I feel this case is extremely symbolic for that moment, that, you know, that the West, using all its power, of course, you always can say it's too difficult to solve the Crimea, the Donbas. But here it's the destiny of one person, and still the top European leaders can't do anything. So really, what could be also the discussion? As now I'm asking you as a policy analyst as well.
I don't know. It's yeah, it is true that European leaders have tried to raise it with Putin. Also Merkel has, as far as I know. And if that doesn't work, I don't know what else can be done. But I think still it's something that the Kremlin doesn't understand well is that such things also have cumulative effect. You get away with one thing, you know. You get away with Litvinenko. You get away with MH17, but in the end, it gets you. It is not like you start from clean page each time. I think over time it'll translate into the totally transformed attitudes towards Russia, totally different Russia strategies, and that I think we will yet see.
Thanks a lot for the discussion, and I have to mention it's rare when we have a discussion on foreign policy and never have mentioned the word Trump. That was the Sunday show at Hromadske International from our partners at Riga Security Conference. I'll encourage you to follow our social networks, Twitter, Facebook, search Hromadske International, sign up for our newsletter at our webpage, en.hromadske.ua. We are working there 24/7 for you, explaining Eastern Europe. So, see you next week.
Yeah.